The sound of a piano echoed through the spacious living room of Nina and Mark's suburban home. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden floors and tastefully arranged furniture. To anyone who visited, the house was a testament to their harmonious relationship. Refined, immaculate, and built to last. Nina was the picture of success. A confident lawyer in her mid-30s, she had worked tirelessly to climb the ladder at her prestigious law firm. She had a sharp mind, a disarming smile, and an aura that commanded attention wherever she went. Colleagues often joked that her life seemed like a perfectly crafted story. The dream job, the perfect house, and a husband who adored her. Mark, on the other hand, was a different kind of success. A novelist by trade, he spent most of his days tucked away in his study, weaving dark tales of human behavior. His latest book was gaining traction, but fame had never been his goal. He was content with his quiet life, finding solace in the pages he wrote and the occasional visits from close friends. Their marriage, from the outside, seemed unshakable. Friends envied their dynamic. Mark's introspective creativity balanced by Nina's pragmatic confidence. They were the couple everyone aspired to be. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, subtle, almost imperceptible, but growing. Mark often found himself sitting alone in the evenings, staring at the blank screen of his laptop, unable to focus. Nina, meanwhile, was increasingly distracted, her phone lighting up with messages she quickly dismissed when Mark was nearby. "I have a meeting tonight," she said one evening, slipping into her tailored coat. "Don't wait up." Mark smiled and nodded, brushing it off. Nina's job was demanding, her absences weren't unusual. Yet, as he sat down to dinner alone, a strange unease began to settle over him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Their life, perfect as it seemed, was beginning to show its imperfections. And Mark, though he didn't know it yet, was about to uncover truths that would shatter the carefully crafted facade of their perfect life. A few days later, as Mark was tidying up the living room, he noticed something unusual on the side table near the couch. A sparkling bracelet nestled in its velvet box. Its design was intricate, delicate, and far too expensive for something Nina would have bought on a whim. Mark picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The diamonds caught the light, sending small prisms across the room. He frowned. Nina wasn't one for extravagant jewelry. She preferred subtle pieces, and they always discussed such purchases beforehand. When Nina came home that evening, Mark casually brought up the bracelet. "Hey, I found this. Did you buy it for yourself?" Nina glanced at it, her smile almost imperceptibly strained. "Oh, that? It was a gift from a client. Just a thank you for helping them win a big case." Mark nodded, but something about her explanation felt off. Nina wasn't the type to accept personal gifts from clients, let alone something this lavish. "Generous client," he remarked, keeping his tone light. She shrugged, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist. "You know how people can be. Sometimes they go overboard. I didn't think much of it." Mark didn't press further, but the unease from that night grew stronger. He couldn't pinpoint why the bracelet bothered him so much, but it planted a seed of suspicion in his mind. Nina's explanation didn't sit right. If it were so innocent, why hadn't she mentioned it earlier? That night, as Mark lay in bed pretending to read, he watched Nina from the corner of his eye. She was on her phone, her expression relaxed, but her fingers moved quickly over the screen. "What's so interesting?" he asked, breaking the silence. Nina startled slightly but quickly recovered. "Just emails," she said, putting her phone down. "Work never ends." Mark smiled, but his mind churned. Something wasn't adding up, and he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was more to Nina's story. For the first time in their marriage, Mark found himself wondering if he truly knew the woman lying beside him. Mark's suspicions simmered quietly over the next few weeks, though he told himself he was being paranoid. Their friend Ethan, however, was a welcome distraction. Charming and extroverted, Ethan had been a part of Mark's life since childhood. He often stopped by to check in on Mark, bringing lively conversation and much-needed breaks from his solitary writing sessions. Ethan was everything Mark wasn't: gregarious, adventurous, and effortlessly charismatic. Nina and Ethan had always gotten along well, their banter flowing easily. Mark appreciated their friendship. It made gatherings more entertaining and lighthearted. Yet lately, Mark noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. Ethan's visits had grown more frequent, often aligning with times when Nina was home. Their conversations seemed more intimate, their laughter louder. It wasn't anything overt, but small moments stood out. A lingering glance, a shared inside joke Mark didn't understand. The way Nina's face lit up when Ethan entered the room. One evening, while Ethan was over, Mark went to the kitchen to grab drinks. As he returned, he paused in the hallway, overhearing hushed voices. "I told you to be careful," Nina whispered, her tone sharp yet nervous. Ethan chuckled softly. "Relax. He doesn't suspect a thing." Mark stepped into the room, pretending he hadn't heard. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. Ethan grinned, his charm as disarming as ever. "Just giving Nina a hard time about work. She's been so stressed lately." Nina shot Ethan a look but quickly masked it with a smile. "He's exaggerating, as usual." Mark handed them their drinks, but the exchange lingered in his mind. That night, after Ethan left, Mark couldn't sleep. He replayed their conversation, dissecting every word, every glance. It wasn't like Nina to keep secrets from him, or was it? The bond between Ethan and Nina seemed to be shifting, becoming something more than friendship. Mark's unease solidified into something darker. Suspicion. For the first time, the idea that his wife might be betraying him crossed his mind. And he hated himself for even considering it. Mark's suspicion festered, gnawing at him during his quiet writing hours. He became hyper-aware of Nina's movements, her conversations, and the moments she spent on her phone. The bracelet, Ethan's frequent visits, and the whispers he'd overheard. All of it painted an unsettling picture. One evening, when Nina left the house claiming she had to meet a client, Mark decided to act. He had never been one for prying, but the growing disquiet within him demanded answers. He discreetly installed small cameras in the living room and kitchen, areas where Ethan and Nina often lingered when they were alone. Days turned into weeks, and Mark's routine of reviewing the footage became a ritual. For a while, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just conversations, shared laughter, and the mundane rhythm of their lives. He began to question his own paranoia. Maybe he had been wrong. But then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Mark, sitting in his study with his headphones on, decided to review the day's footage. At first, it was ordinary. Nina returning home from work, Ethan arriving shortly after with his usual carefree energy. They sat on the couch, chatting. And then it happened. Ethan leaned closer to Nina, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. A soft, intimate smile Mark hadn't seen in years. Ethan's hand lingered on her cheek before he kissed her. It wasn't just a fleeting kiss. It was charged, deliberate, and full of unspoken emotions. Mark felt his breath catch. He rewound the footage, watching it again, hoping he had misinterpreted what he saw. But the scene remained the same. They kissed, held each other, whispered words too quiet for the cameras to pick up. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. Mark closed his laptop, his mind racing. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself but in the ease with which they had done it. As if Mark didn't exist, as if his trust and love were irrelevant. For hours, he sat in silence, staring at the darkened screen. The anger and heartbreak he felt were unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But beneath it all, a cold, calculating resolve began to take shape. This wasn't going to end with tears and apologies. This was going to end his way. Mark spent the next few days in a fog of cold determination. He couldn't confront Nina, not yet. He needed to understand the full extent of her betrayal, to uncover every hidden layer before making his move. His love for her had been replaced by a gnawing desire for justice, one that consumed his every thought. Late one evening, Nina returned home later than usual. She kissed Mark on the cheek, her smile as warm and disarming as ever. "Long day," she said, heading upstairs to shower. Mark watched her go, feeling a pang of disgust at how effortlessly she carried on her double life. Once she was asleep, Mark took her phone from the nightstand. He knew the password. It was their anniversary date, a cruel irony he couldn't ignore. With trembling fingers, he navigated to her messages. What he found made his stomach turn. Ethan's name was listed under a fake contact, Linda Work. Their conversations were a blend of flirtation, longing, and mockery. They joked about Mark's reclusive nature, about how he was so wrapped up in his novels that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. One message from Ethan stood out. "When are we telling him? He deserves to know, doesn't he?" Nina's reply was colder than Mark expected. "Not yet. He's fragile. Let's give it time." Fragile. The word echoed in Mark's mind, cutting deeper than any betrayal. She thought he was weak, incapable of handling the truth. But they had underestimated him, both of them. In the days that followed, Mark began to set his plan in motion. He studied Nina and Ethan's routines, noting every detail. He also began subtly withdrawing from Nina, his demeanor calm but distant. She didn't seem to notice, her attention was elsewhere. One evening, Mark invited Ethan over for drinks. "It's been a while since we've caught up," he said, masking his fury with a friendly smile. Ethan agreed without hesitation. When the night came, the tension in the room was palpable. Ethan laughed and joked as always, oblivious to Mark's simmering rage. But Mark didn't let it show. Instead, he leaned into his role as the oblivious, supportive friend. As they talked, Mark felt a strange sense of power. Ethan and Nina thought they had the upper hand, but they were playing right into his trap. By the end of the night, as Ethan left, Mark stood at the window, watching him walk down the street. His mind raced with plans, each more elaborate than the last. Ethan and Nina didn't just betray him, they underestimated him. And they were about to learn just how wrong they had been. Mark's plan began to take shape, but he realized he couldn't do it alone. He needed an ally, someone who could offer insight and perspective. He found an unlikely partner in Claire, Nina's closest friend. Claire and Mark had always gotten along, but their relationship had been more casual than deep. That was about to change. Mark invited Claire over under the pretense of discussing a surprise party for Nina's upcoming birthday. Over coffee, he carefully steered the conversation toward Nina and Ethan. "Have you noticed anything off between them?" Mark asked, his tone light but probing. Claire hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Mark couldn't quite read. "Why do you ask?" Mark sighed, feigning vulnerability. "I don't know. Lately, I've just had this nagging feeling, like they're closer than they should be." Claire looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Mark, I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but yes, I've noticed things. Nina talks about Ethan more than she should. And there have been moments, little things, that didn't sit right with me." Mark leaned back, his heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire met his gaze, her expression torn. "Because I didn't want to hurt you. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, and I didn't want to create problems where there might not be any." Mark nodded slowly, his respect for Claire growing. "You weren't imagining it. I have proof." He showed her the footage and messages, watching as her face shifted from shock to anger. "How could they do this to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with outrage. Mark hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Claire, do you think Nina is capable of deeper betrayal? Not just the affair, but something more calculated?" Claire's lips tightened. "I wouldn't have thought so before, but seeing this, I don't know. It's like she's a different person." Mark saw the pain in Claire's eyes. Pain not just for him but for the friendship she thought she had with Nina. It was a betrayal that cut deeply for both of them. "I need your help," Mark said quietly. "I want to make sure they understand what they've done, that they can't just walk away from this unscathed." Claire's eyes narrowed, a spark of determination lighting in them. "Tell me what you need." With Claire on his side, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, They began to weave a plan that would expose Nina and Ethan for who they truly were, and make them pay for every moment of deceit. Mark and Claire spent the next week fine-tuning their plan. It had to be perfect, a combination of psychological unraveling and public exposure. Mark's dark imagination, honed through years of writing novels, combined with Claire's intimate knowledge of Nina and Ethan's habits, made for a formidable team. The first step was to lure both Nina and Ethan into a false sense of security. Mark acted as though nothing was amiss, while Claire played the supportive friend, subtly encouraging Nina's belief that her secret was safe. The opportunity for the perfect setup came when Nina suggested hosting a dinner party to rekindle their relationship. "Just the four of us," she said. "You, me, Ethan, and Claire. It'll be fun." Mark smiled, masking the storm brewing inside him. "That sounds like a great idea." As the day of the dinner approached, Mark made his final preparations. He created a series of carefully edited videos using the footage he had collected. Each clip was designed to reveal the depth of Nina and Ethan's betrayal, but in a way that would leave no room for denial. He also prepared a speech calm, deliberate, and devastatingly honest. It wasn't just about exposing their affair. It was about dismantling the image they had of themselves as untouchable, about stripping away the lies they had wrapped around their betrayal. When the night arrived, the atmosphere was deceptively light. The table was set with Nina's favorite dishes, and the wine flowed freely. Ethan, as always, was charming and confident, while Nina seemed radiant, her laughter filling the room. Mark played his role perfectly, engaging in conversation and pretending to enjoy himself. But Claire, sitting beside him, caught the glint in his eye, the quiet fury he kept hidden beneath his calm exterior. After dinner, Mark stood and raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice steady. "To honesty and trust, the foundations of every meaningful relationship." Nina and Ethan exchanged a quick, nervous glance, but Mark continued, unfazed. "And to the truths we share with one another, and the ones we try to keep hidden." With that, he picked up a remote control and pressed play on the first video. The screen behind him lit up, showing a clip of Nina and Ethan in an intimate moment. The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the video playing. Nina's face drained of color, while Ethan's confident smile vanished. "What is this?" Nina whispered, her voice shaking. Mark turned to her, his expression devoid of emotion. "This is what you've built our marriage on, Nina. Lies and betrayal." Claire sat silently, her presence a quiet reminder that Nina's web of deceit extended further than just Mark. As the video ended, Mark crossed his arms and looked at the two of them. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "I've spent my life writing stories about betrayal. Now you're going to live one." The tension in the room was suffocating, but Mark felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The pieces were in place and the trap was sprung. The air in the dining room was thick with tension as the first video ended. Ethan's face had turned pale, his usual charm evaporating into a stunned silence. Nina sat frozen, her eyes wide and glassy as she stared at the now dark screen. Mark poured himself another glass of wine, his movements calm and deliberate. "Oh, don't look so surprised," he said, his tone cold. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't figure it out?" "Mark," Nina stammered, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." Mark cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Not what it looks like? Really? Do you take me for a fool, Nina? Because you've certainly treated me like one." Ethan finally found his voice. "Look, man, I'm sorry." "Sorry." Mark turned to Ethan, his eyes burning with contempt. "You're sorry? You've been my friend for over 2 decades. Ethan, my best friend. And you thought it was okay to betray me in the worst way possible." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Mark held up a hand to silence him. "No. You don't get to apologize. Not yet. Not until you understand the extent of what you've done." Claire, sitting quietly in the corner, spoke for the first time. "You both disgust me," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Did you ever stop to think about how your actions would affect anyone else? Or were you too busy indulging in your little secret? Nina turned to Claire, her face crumbling. Claire, don't, Claire snapped. Don't you dare try to justify this. Mark leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. I wanted this to be private. But then I thought, why keep it between us? Why not let the world see who you really are? With that, he pressed another button on the remote. The screen flickered to life again, this time displaying emails, text messages, and photos that Nina and Ethan had shared over the months. Each image was damning, each message a knife to the heart. Nina buried her face in her hands, sobbing, while Ethan sat motionless, his jaw clenched. You thought I didn't notice the late nights, the secret looks, the way you laughed a little too hard at each other's jokes. Mark continued, his voice steady and cold. But I see everything. I always have. The weight of Mark's words hung in the air, crushing the illusion of control Nina and Ethan had clung to. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the depth of their betrayal. Not just of Mark, but of the trust and love they had so carelessly destroyed. Mark straightened, his eyes scanning the broken faces before him. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice a quiet promise. You've built your lies on my life, my trust. Now I'm going to take it all away. The room was silent, save for Nina's quiet sobs and the distant hum of the screen. The dinner had become a reckoning, and Mark had only just begun. The silence after Mark's declaration was suffocating, broken only by Nina's choked sobs. Ethan sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale and devoid of its usual smug confidence. Claire stood, her arms crossed tightly, her piercing glare bouncing between Nina and Ethan. Mark set the remote on the table and folded his hands calmly. You see, I wasn't content with just exposing your affair. That would have been too simple, too clean. I wanted you both to feel the weight of every choice you've made. Nina raised her tear-streaked face, her voice a desperate whisper. Mark, please, let's talk about this. Just you and me. Talk. Mark's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. We stopped talking the moment you let him into our home, into my life. There's nothing left to discuss. He turned to Ethan, his expression darkening. And you, my so-called best friend, do you have anything to say? Or is your silence just another cowardly excuse? Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and tight. Mark, he hesitated, struggling to find the words. I didn't mean for this to happen. Mark's fist slammed onto the table, making Nina flinch. Didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't just trip and fall into my wife. Ethan, you made choices, calculated, deliberate choices to betray me. Claire's voice cut through the heated exchange, cool and sharp. And let's not forget the other betrayal. She pulled out a folder from her bag and tossed it onto the table. Ethan, do you want to explain these? Nina and Ethan both froze as Mark opened the folder, revealing bank statements, receipts, and a trail of transactions linking Ethan to a fraudulent scheme involving one of Nina's clients. What is this? Nina asked, her voice cracking. Your lover here, Claire said, her tone laced with venom, has been siphoning money from your firm's clients under your name. He's been using your access to cover his tracks. Nina turned to Ethan, her face a mixture of shock and fury. Is this true? Ethan's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Mark leaned back, his eyes cold. You didn't just betray me, Ethan. You dragged Nina into a mess that could ruin her career. I'd say you're a special kind of scum. Nina's sobs grew louder, her once composed demeanor crumbling entirely. I didn't know any of this. Mark's gaze didn't soften. Didn't you? Or were you too distracted by your little affair to notice? Claire, standing tall and resolute, stepped forward. This isn't just about Mark. You've hurt more people than you realize, Ethan. And now you're going to face the consequences. Ethan's confidence finally shattered, his head dropping into his hands. The weight of his actions, compounded by Mark and Claire's revelations, crushed any remaining facade of control. Mark stood, towering over the table. You both took everything I valued and twisted it into something vile. Now, I'll make sure you lose what you hold most dear. The night was far from over, and Mark's reckoning had only just begun. The room was a tableau of destruction. Nina crumbling in tears, Ethan silently consumed by guilt and shame, and Claire, her presence like a judge presiding over a court of retribution. Mark remained standing, his calm exterior masking the storm within him. He turned to Claire, a silent signal passing between them. Claire stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. Ethan, you've not only betrayed Mark but also dragged me into this mess. You remember, don't you? The investment deal you promised me years ago, the one that conveniently disappeared along with my savings. Ethan's head shot up, his face stricken. Claire, I didn't mean. Don't, she snapped, her tone icy. You used me just like you've used everyone else in your life. But not anymore. Mark's voice, quiet but resolute, drew the attention back to him. You see, Ethan, your betrayal didn't just hurt me. It brought Claire and me together. And now we've decided that you deserve to lose everything, just as we did. Nina looked up, her face streaked with tears. Mark, please don't do this. I made a mistake, but I never meant to hurt you. Mark's cold gaze didn't waver. You made a choice, Nina, and choices have consequences. He pulled out a second folder, placing it on the table in front of Ethan. These are the financial records Claire helped me gather. They link you to multiple fraudulent activities: embezzlement, forgery, tax evasion. With one phone call, I can ensure that every bit of it reaches the authorities. Ethan stared at the folder, his face pale. You wouldn't. Mark leaned closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. Try me. Nina's sobs filled the silence, her pleas barely coherent. Mark, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Just don't destroy us. Mark straightened, his expression devoid of empathy. You already destroyed us, Nina. I'm just ensuring you live with the consequences. Claire took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. Here's the deal, Ethan. You'll sign over the money you've stolen, every penny. And you'll leave this town, this life, for good. If you refuse, Mark and I will make sure your name becomes synonymous with disgrace. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the folder. He flipped through the damning evidence, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, he muttered. I'll do it. Mark turned to Nina, his voice devoid of emotion. And you? You can stay and face the fallout of your lies. Or you can leave and start over somewhere else. Either way, I'm done. Nina's face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no coming back from this. Mark and Claire had forged a dark pact, united by betrayal and fueled by the need for justice. Ethan and Nina's worlds were collapsing, and there was no escape from the reckoning that had been set in motion. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The weight of his crimes, and the evidence Mark and Claire had meticulously gathered, pressed down on him like a vice. By morning, he realized there was no escape. He arrived at Mark's house the next day with a folder of documents, his face pale and his eyes hollow. Mark and Claire sat at the dining table, their expressions cold and detached. Ethan slid the folder across the table without a word. Mark opened it, flipping through the pages. It contained signed agreements, financial transfers, and statements authorizing the return of all stolen funds. Every penny, Ethan mumbled, his voice barely audible. It's all there. Mark closed the folder, satisfied. Good. Now, as agreed, you'll leave. Pack your things and go. Tonight. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew he had no leverage, no room to negotiate. You've ruined me, he said bitterly. No, Mark replied, his voice icy. You ruined yourself. I just gave you the consequences you worked so hard to avoid. Claire added, her tone sharp. Consider yourself lucky we're letting you walk away at all. If it were up to me, you'd be rotting in a cell. Ethan looked at her, but the fire in her eyes made him avert his gaze. He turned and left, the sound of the door closing echoing through the house. Over the next few days, Mark and Claire ensured Ethan's financial misdeeds were rectified. The stolen money was returned to its rightful owners, and any loose ends were tied up. But they didn't stop there. Mark had one more blow to deliver. Using his network of contacts, Mark anonymously leaked the story of Ethan's fraudulent activities to local news outlets. Articles detailing his crimes spread quickly, painting Ethan as a manipulative con artist. His reputation was destroyed, his name synonymous with deceit. Ethan's friends and acquaintances turned their backs on him, and his attempts to rebuild his life were met with rejection at every turn. The world he had carefully constructed crumbled into dust, leaving him a broken man. One evening, Mark received a message from Claire. "It's done. He's gone." Mark stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "Good. One down." There was still Nina to contend with, and Mark's vengeance was far from complete. Mark turned his attention to Nina. Unlike Ethan, she wasn't a criminal, but her betrayal cut even deeper. Mark knew her greatest strength, and her greatest vulnerability was her career. She had built her reputation as a formidable lawyer on the pillars of integrity and trust. Mark intended to show the world the hypocrisy hidden behind that polished facade. The first strike came subtly. Mark anonymously forwarded some of Nina's private emails to her firm's senior partners. These emails, filled with flirtatious exchanges between her and Ethan, painted her in an unprofessional light. Mark carefully curated the messages to highlight her disregard for ethical boundaries without fully exposing the affair. Yet, the fallout was immediate. Nina was summoned to a meeting with the firm's leadership, where she was confronted with the emails. Her defense, that they were personal and had nothing to do with work, did little to placate her superiors. The damage to her reputation was done. Whispers spread through the office, and Nina's once commanding presence began to falter under the weight of judgmental stares. Mark's next move was more public. At a high-profile legal conference, where Nina was set to give a keynote speech, Mark made sure her secret became a spectacle. He paid a tech-savvy acquaintance to hack into the event's presentation system, replacing Nina's slides with incriminating messages and photos. As Nina took the stage expecting to deliver her well-prepared speech, the projector lit up with the damning evidence. Images of her with Ethan, screenshots of their intimate conversations, and quotes from their cruel jokes about Mark. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Nina stood frozen, her face ashen, as the audience stared in shock and disbelief. She fumbled for the microphone, her voice cracking as she tried to explain, but the damage was irreversible. Within hours, videos of the incident flooded social media. Nina's humiliation became a trending topic, her name associated with scandal and disgrace. Clients began withdrawing their accounts from her firm, and her colleagues distanced themselves to protect their own reputations. When Nina returned home that night, her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She found Mark waiting for her, his expression unreadable. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with anger and despair. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold and unyielding. "How could I? Nina, this is nothing compared to what you did to me. I just gave the world a glimpse of the truth. You're the one who built your life on lies." Nina sank onto the couch, her body trembling. "I lost everything," she said, her voice barely audible. Mark's expression didn't soften. "So did I. The difference is, I didn't deserve it." He stood and walked away, leaving Nina to grapple with the ruins of her life. Nina's life spiraled further into chaos. The once confident, high-powered lawyer now found herself ostracized by her peers and abandoned by her friends. Clients who had once sung her praises severed ties, and even the few who had stayed loyal began to question her integrity. She was demoted at her firm, relegated to menial tasks that made her feel invisible. At home, Mark maintained a cold civility, speaking to her only when necessary. The warmth and partnership that had defined their marriage were long gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Nina tried to apologize, to plead for forgiveness, but Mark dismissed her words with a stoic indifference that cut deeper than anger. Nina's isolation extended beyond her professional life. The scandal had spread like wildfire through their social circle. Friends avoided her calls, and neighbors no longer stopped to chat. Even Claire, once her closest confidant, refused to speak to her. Nina was left alone, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a crushing tide. Her days blurred together in a haze of regret and despair. She spent hours scrolling through her phone, reading the vitriol spewed about her on social media. Every cruel comment, every mocking meme felt like another nail in the coffin of her old life. Mark, meanwhile, thrived in his newfound freedom. He focused on his writing, channeling the pain of betrayal into his next novel. The story, a dark, twisted tale of deception and revenge, poured out of him with an ease he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as he sat in his study, Mark received a message from Claire. "She's unraveling. Are you sure this is enough?" Mark stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he typed back, "It's enough. She needs to feel what I felt." Nina's breaking point came late one night when she discovered that her bracelet, the one Ethan had given her, was missing. She tore through the house, searching every drawer, every corner, but it was nowhere to be found. Finally, in desperation, she confronted Mark. "Where is it?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. Mark looked up from his book, his face calm. "Where's what?" "The bracelet. The one Ethan gave me. Did you take it?" Mark's lips curved into a cold smile. "You mean the symbol of your betrayal?" "I threw it away." Nina's eyes filled with tears. "You had no right." Mark's gaze hardened. "No, Nina. You had no right to betray me, to mock me, to destroy everything we built. That bracelet was just a reminder of what you chose over us." Nina sank to the floor, her sobs echoing through the empty house. Mark watched her for a moment before returning to his book, leaving her to drown in her solitude. For Nina, the isolation was complete. For Mark, it was justice served. Ethan's new life was a shadow of his former one. Forced to leave town, he found himself in a rundown apartment miles from anyone he knew. His finances were in ruins, his reputation destroyed, and every door he knocked on for help remained firmly shut. The once charismatic charmer now moved through life as a pariah. Mark's anonymous leak to the press had ensured that Ethan's story reached far and wide. Employers refused to hire him, landlords hesitated to lease to him, and even old acquaintances pretended not to recognize him. The weight of his disgrace bore down on him, and the guilt of what he had done to Mark haunted his every waking moment. One night, as Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, a package arrived. Confused, he opened it to find a single item, a printed manuscript. The title on the cover sent a shiver down his spine. The Betrayal of Trust. Inside, Ethan found Mark's latest novel, a fictionalized account of their affair. The story was raw, unflinching, and painfully accurate, capturing every detail of their betrayal and its consequences. Ethan read it in one sitting, each page a mirror reflecting his darkest actions. At the end of the book, Mark had written a dedication. "To the friends who taught me that even the strongest bonds can be broken by selfishness. May you find the peace I've made for myself." Ethan threw the book across the room, his anger and shame boiling over. But as he sat there in the silence, his emotions gave way to despair. Mark had not only destroyed his life, he had immortalized Ethan's betrayal for the world to see. The manuscript's release became a sensation. Critics praised it as Mark's most powerful work yet, a searing exploration of betrayal and revenge. Ethan's identity, though not explicitly named, was evident to those who knew him. The parallels were too strong to ignore, and whispers of recognition followed him everywhere. Ethan began to unravel. He isolated himself further, avoiding even the simplest human interactions. The weight of Mark's revenge was unbearable, and the cracks in his facade widened with each passing day. Mark, meanwhile, watched from a distance. He had no contact with Ethan, no interest in his excuses or apologies. For Mark, the manuscript wasn't just a book. It was the final nail in the coffin of Ethan's betrayal, a way to reclaim his narrative and find closure. Ethan, left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, spiraled deeper into despair. His fall from grace was complete, and he had no one to blame but himself. Mark's revenge had been cruel, calculated, and unrelenting. But for Ethan, It was a reminder that some betrayals leave scars too deep to heal. Nina sat at the dining table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The walls seemed to close in on her, each echoing moment a reminder of what she had lost. She had reached the end of her rope and knew there was only one thing left to do: reach out to Mark one last time. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling as she began to write. "Mark, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I need to apologize, not just for the affair, but for every moment I made you feel less than the incredible man you are. What I did was selfish, cruel, and thoughtless. I betrayed not only you but the life we built together. There is no excuse for what I did, and I won't insult you by trying to offer one. You gave me everything: love, trust, and a safe place to call home, and I threw it all away. I see now how blind I was to your pain. I see how my actions tore you apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the man I once knew. For that, I am sorry in a way words cannot express. You've made it clear that there's no path forward for us, and I don't blame you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to let go of the anger I caused. You deserve peace, Mark. You deserve happiness. I've decided to leave. There's nothing left for me here, and I think it's time I stop clinging to the wreckage of what I destroyed. I hope you'll find someone who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. Goodbye, Mark. Thank you for everything, even if I didn't realize its worth until it was too late. Nina." She folded the letter neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter where Mark would find it. Then, with a heavy heart, she packed her bags and left the house for the last time. The streets were dark and empty as she drove away, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her chest. When Mark found the letter the next morning, he read it slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't cry, didn't rage. He simply placed the letter back on the counter and stared out the window. For Mark, this was the end of the chapter. Nina was gone, Ethan was destroyed, and the life he once knew was now a memory. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet, hollow sense of closure. Mark turned back to his desk, where his manuscript sat waiting. He picked up his pen and began to write again, ready to turn the page and start a new story, this time one entirely his own.